It is my privilege tonight to introduce our speaker, Dr. Susan Gubar, Distinguished Professor of English at Indiana University, Bloomington, and our Arts and Sciences Distinguished Lecturer at IPFW for the year 2000. Her visit to our campus is financially supported by the Addison Locke Roach Memorial Fund Committee of Indiana University, for which we are very grateful, and is sponsored by the School of Arts and Sciences. One hardly knows where to begin to highlight Professor Susan Gubar's awards and accomplishments. You can read about some of them in your program. However, there is no question that Dr. Gubar's now legendary collaborations with Professor Sandra Gilbert of the University of California, Davis, most certainly changed the face of feminist literary criticism with the groundbreaking 1979 Pulitzer and National Book Critics Circle Award nominated Mad Woman in the Attic, The Woman Writer and the 19th Century Literary Imagination. And almost a decade later, in 1988 and 89, with the two-volume No Man's Land, The Place of the Woman Writer in the 20th Century. This respected team of Gilbert and Gubar, as they are referred to in American letters, also deeply impacted the teaching of literature by women with the now classic co-edited volume, The Norton Anthology of Literature by Women, The Tradition in English. The recipient of Guggenheim, NEH, and Rockefeller Fellowships, and at IU of a Senior Class Council Outstanding Teaching Award, an Amico Foundation Award for Distinguished Teaching, and Distinguished Scholar Awards from both the College of Arts and Sciences and the Office of Women's Affairs. Professor Gubar, the single author of scores of essays, published in 1997 her first solo book, Racechanges, White Skin, Blackface in American Culture, the topic of tonight's presentation. In this book, which has been called, quote, brilliant scholarship of tremendous significance, unquote, by Pulitzer Prize winner Toni Morrison, Professor Gubar correlates race issues with arts and media by examining cross-racial impersonations, or race changes, in film, poetry, painting, photography, and journalism. More recently, Professor Gubar has published with Columbia University Press a collection of essays titled Critical Condition, Feminist Studies at the Turn of the Century, and has under contract with Indiana University Press, Poetry nach Auschwitz, Remembering What One Never Knew. And now, with no further delay, help me to welcome to IPFW Professor Susan Gubar.
Pleasure to see some old friends in the audience. How nice. Can you hear me in the back? Kind of, sort of. Okay, I'm going to speak up. Is that better? All right, would you just raise your hands if you're having trouble? Let's see how the dimming works, okay? Because I'm giving Linda a little bit of time. The remote did not come. So, medium doesn't seem to work. Dim doesn't seem to work. Maybe that's good. Okay. All right, we'll start with normal lighting, but you're going to get to snooze through a lot of this. Just this month, on September 18th, Newsweek magazine produced a cover story on redefining race in America. The old labels of black and white can't begin to capture the subtleties of blood and identity, the editors proclaimed. Nuances of brown and yellow and red have transformed the face of race, or so changes in the census categories suggest. In 1860, there were only 3 census categories: white, black, quadroon. But this year, there are 30, from Asian Indian to other Pacific Islanders, and there are 11 categories under Hispanic ethnicity. In California, Hawaii, New Mexico, and Washington, D.C., whites are now in the minority, as they will very soon be in Florida and Texas. At this moment, while new ethnic multiplicities appear to be eclipsing the old dualities, it seems appropriate to look back in chagrin and in some surprise at how very prominent a role the black-white divide has played in American society. Has its death been prematurely announced and celebrated, or do we still labor under the old black-white division and divisiveness? Will the new ethnic multiplicities work for or against strengthening the position of people who continue to define themselves as African Americans? One lesson we can immediately take into the future from the history of slavery and segregation in this country pertains to the need for the new ethnic minorities to represent themselves. For much of our cultural baggage has been weighted down by whites defining what it means to be black, by whites representing African Americans throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Although there has been a great deal of much-needed scholarship documenting the history of black thinkers and artists lecturing, writing, and performing so as to demonstrate the intellectual and aesthetic acumen of the race, the humanity and subjectivity of African Americans have often been staged by white people performing blackness. That whites have hardly produced flattering pictures of their black contemporaries has contributed to embarrassment and anger over such portrayals. Simultaneously figured and disfigured, blacks who were symbolically presented may have felt themselves effectively erased in aesthetic productions, photographic, filmic, poetic, fictional, that teetered on the edge of grotesque stereotyping and appropriation. My book, Racechanges, White Skin, Blackface, and American Culture, studies the historical background of cross-racial imitation. In it, I attempt to illuminate the psychological motives for and the aesthetic importance of cross-racial impersonation, and that's what I mean by race changes, cross-racial impersonation, and in particular the ways and the reasons why white artists perform or write or look as if they were Africans or African Americans. Today, I'll try to encapsulate my ideas, first about the difference between black and white efforts to cross the color line. That is, I'm going to start by talking about the different motivations African Americans have from what whites have for trying to cross the color line through these cross-racial impersonations. And secondly, I'll then turn to the evolving functions of white masquerades, and I'm going to argue that these white masquerades of blackness shift from mockery to a kind of mimicry, to an emphasis on interracial mutuality and mutability in the course of the century. This is not to say that mockery is replaced by mimicry, or that mimicry is replaced by mutuality. Quite the contrary, we're going to see at the end of this talk that all three modes are still alive and well in contemporary times. Now, Linda has been offering to do some work with the slide projector because the remote did not come, so we'll see if this is going to work. And we'll turn to the first slide, Linda. Can you all see that? Okay. Since classical times, fascinating artifacts have pictured racial contrasts and comparisons. On the one hand, stressing the rigid boundaries separating race from race, while on the other, documenting racial interconnectedness. Hardly a melting pot, this ancient Italian urn, like Keats' Grecian urn, tells us all we know and all we need to know, in this case about racial representation in Western art. Since each face gazes out in a different direction, fated never to see the other, this janiform vase stresses the rigid borders separating the races. However, the burden of the pail borne by both women emphasizes the commerce and commonality between them. Similarly, race change tests the boundaries between racially defined identities, sometimes reinforcing, sometimes challenging the dualistic meanings Western societies have given to color. As the subtitle of my project is meant to indicate, it is deeply indebted to Frantz Fanon's classic attack on racism, Black Skin, White Masks, an analysis of the ways in which imperialist ideologies have contributed to what W.E.B. Du Bois calls the double consciousness of the colonized. And this would be one way of thinking about double consciousness, that is, the psychic self-division experienced by black people who are forced to assimilate into a culture saturated by debilitating overvaluations of whiteness. If freedom and power are only available to people with white skin, a race change imperative from black to white lurks in the subordination of blackness to whiteness in a racist economy. Composed during the Harlem Renaissance, numerous passing novels portrayed black characters effectively instructed by American society that they will only be inducted into it as full citizens with complete personhood if they manage to be black no more, in the words of one famous satirist. Of course, many Harlem Renaissance novelists drew upon the strategy of what James Weldon Johnson called ex-colored people fleeing slavery during those years when looking white became a crucial means of survival. William and Ellen Craft's slave narrative, Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom, featured a frontispiece, which you have here, portraying one such ex-colored person, a passer. Disguised as an invalid white gentleman, Ellen Craft could be accompanied by her dark-skinned husband who took the part of her slave. In case her illiteracy or smooth countenance would betray her, she bound up her right hand in a sling and wore a handkerchief over her cheeks. Whiteness, like maleness, confers authority and privilege, whereas blackness, like femaleness, conveys subordination as well as dependency. Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom, Ellen Craft's manuscript, establishes black to white race change as a bid for freedom, one that would be made again by Homer Plessy at the end of the 19th century when he challenged Louisiana's segregated railroad car law by using his light complexion to gain access to the whites-only car and then announcing himself a Negro. Although the Supreme Court's landmark decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, ruled in favor of segregation, this is 1886, Plessy had used impersonation to undermine the notion that skin color could be conflated with racial identity. Thus, as ex-colored people, Ellen Craft and Homer Plessy suggested that race change could be employed for libertarian purposes, to disentangle race from biological or essentialist definitions. If black people look like white people, can be taken for white people, what constitutes whiteness? But if we take a clue from Toni Morrison's recent work, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination, and examine white rather than black uses of race change, it becomes clear that within the arena of Americans' popular culture, it operated very, very differently. This difference has everything to do with volition or agency. Unlike Ellen Craft and Homer Plessy, who had to pass in order to obtain their freedom, white people chose to pass. White people chose to put on black masks for a variety of motives, ranging from murderous hatred to titillating voyeurism to envious or loving admiration. Whereas cross-racial impersonations functioned within passing narratives in the African American community to dramatize African American efforts to gain the rights of citizens by successfully representing African Americans trying to pass as whites, cross-racial masquerades within posing frameworks often emphasize the artifice of racial performances, that is, the unbridgeable difference between Euro-Americans and Afro-Americans, in order to buttress white privilege, black subordination. Our sympathy with the passer has produced many critical studies. However, our ethical condemnation of the poser has meant we have failed to understand minstrelsy's ongoing legacy in seemingly innovative 20th century art forms. And one of the points of this lecture is that minstrelsy has a very long and ongoing history in contemporary times. To the extent that burnt cork on the 20th century movie actor's face perpetuated the tradition established by Victorian minstrels, we can identify this form of race change as a representational replica of racism, even a ritual form of scapegoating staged almost exclusively by white men. According to historians from Robert Toll to Eric Lott, blackface minstrelsy was America's first and most popular form of theatrical entertainment. And notice the difference here between the white performer and the black character he represents. Can we have the next one? Linda, again, notice the difference between the performer and the performed. Unlike Ellen Craft and Homer Plessy, whose successful counterfeiting proved the permeability of the color line, the minstrels advertised the rigid disparity between the white performers in real life and the black characters they played on stage, thus widening the gap between black and white. Drawing upon the figure of the harlequin, whose dark mask and checkered suit signaled an antic nature, 19th century masquerades of blackness turned African Americans into figures of fun. As Ralph Ellison knew, the joke the race-changing performer shared with his audience in minstrel and vaudeville halls constituted a yoke for those caricatured. The minstrel's depiction of happy-go-lucky slaves dancing and singing about their contentment on the plantation, of uppity dandies aping the ways of their betters in nonsensical speeches, of lascivious or childish wenches added up to an infantilized, even bestialized, imaginary African American, whose most prominent feature was almost always his broadly outlined, wide-open, grinning mouth. I use the word his. Could we go back one, Linda? I use the word his because, as you know, forward, right? Because, as you know, even the women were always played by male actors. So let's go forward. At the beginning of this century, two highly influential, though very different movies, The Birth of a Nation and The Jazz Singer, interpreted the orality of that mouth as either cannibalistic or infantile. As in minstrelsy, in the first blockbuster, The Birth of a Nation, and the first talkie, The Jazz Singer, blackface allowed white men to repeat and rationalize the grievous injury inflicted on black people by slavery. Haunted by anxiety about the destruction of African American lives, white filmmakers, actors, and audiences obsessively returned to burnt cork, for it functioned as an effective method of obliterating the black body again and again, substituting in its stead not only the white body, but the white man's parodic imitation black body. Thus, the race change effected by blackface operates as a kind of character assassination, or a kind of spirit murder. Not a physical attack on the actual other, but a murderous symbolic assault on the imagined other. In Birth of a Nation, which you have here, a still from here, the white man's parodic imitation black body transformed the greedy, grinning mouth of the minstrel into a portrait of devouring black rapacity. White actors in blackface, effectively erasing black subjectivity, present African Americans as sexually and politically so voracious that they threaten to cannibalize white society. In Griffin's movie, the satanically ambitious leader of the Black Party, that's the man on your left, whose name is Lynch, stands for his determination to lynch whites. And he threatens to rape white women and contaminate the lineage of white men. Another would-be rapist, Gus, and he's played by an actor who was instructed to gargle with hydrogen peroxide to create the effect of foaming at the mouth, presumably earns the punishment exacted by the Christian Knights of the Klan. This comes from the novel that the movie was based on. Can we have the next one? Wearing their phallic hats, wielding their potent swords, the potent members of the Klan vanquish Gus and Lynch, thereby demonstrating that the birth of the American nation is predicated on the death of African Americans. We might say it's also predicated on the birth of the death of African Americans is also predicated on the birth of the American film industry. Both in Dixon's original novel and Griffin's movie adaptation, blackface marks that hope, the time when the only black men, and it is fairly explicit in terms of gender, will really be whites in blackface. If Griffin's film blackmails or criminalizes the African American, the jazz singer seems more benign in its return to the clownishness of minstrelsy. Indeed, whereas Birth of the Nation hypersexualizes black men so as to justify their lynching, the jazz singer's portrayal of a weeping, wailing, black-faced Jolson unmans or even feminizes. With his Jewish mama here, and can we have the next one, Linda? And with his Gentile girlfriend here, Jolson in Burnt Cork looks dependent, worried, stymied. Paradoxically, then, by substituting boy for buck, the Warner Brothers movie reenacts another character assassination or spirit murder. The two faces of white Jackie Rabinowitz from the Jewish ghetto and black Jack Robbins on stage embody the central character's paralyzing self-division. This is a movie about a Jewish boy who leaves the synagogue and singing in the synagogue as a cantor to become a Broadway performer. But Jack remains torn between Mama and Shiksa, the sacred prayers of the temple and the secular songs of Broadway. Guilt over assimilation, defying paternal law, leaving the synagogue, marrying out of the faith, informs blackface in the jazz singer, splashing over the African American, whose visible marks of difference mean he is not as free as the Jew to make these quite advantageous compromises of integration. Since the black embodies otherness, the Jew who merely plays him becomes less other. As in The Birth of a Nation, the American certifies his identity by proving himself not African American. James Baldwin's point, and I'm quoting Baldwin here, the price the white man paid for his ticket for passage from the old to the new world was to become white, informs the Warner Brothers movie. At the same time, though, Jolson in blackface looks like he's doing penance for social acceptance attained by stereotyping black people. As the soundtrack returns to Kol Nidre, the prayer for the Jewish Day of Atonement, the Jew who stands in the place of the stigmatized black uncannily replicates the other's suffering, a point to which this publicity poster attests. No, let's go back. Why do the dead return? Asked the Lacanian critic Zizek in his study of horror films, and he answers, because they were not properly buried. Blackface performances which justify white oppression of blacks by making African Americans look culpable for their own oppression dramatizes a horrific return of the displaced black body, now paradoxically born on and reborn in the white body. For the Jolson figure here, to my eyes anyway, looks terrified. The mouth, less the familiar grin, so much as gaping open in anguish or fear. The body suffering the absence inflicted on African Americans by blackface. And this, can we have the next one, is a mimetic mirroring confirmed by a Nazi poster of the so-called degenerate jazz Jew, because the fascist ideology here, of course, reconflates the Jew and the black, both equally degenerate in this poster of degenerate art. You see the Jewish star, and no. You see the Jewish star, and you see the stereotypical black jazz singer conflated here. Okay, we can go, Linda. Thank you. You all know who that is. Good. Perhaps blackface movies so often return to the social justice issues raised by the Civil War because what propels cross-racial masquerading, I'm arguing, is white guilt about a past injurious to black people. Here we see Shirley Temple in The Littlest Rebel, 1936. The next slide, you will see, Linda, the next slide. Bing Crosby, of course, in Holiday Inn. Whitewash our past by producing foolish black characters clearly accountable for any bigotry they may have suffered. White impersonations of blacks who legitimized supremacist ideologies by making African Americans look culpable repeatedly dramatized a femicidal Othello. The next slide is from A Double Life, and this Othello murders his Desdemona through a kiss of death, getting back to the orality of the mouth again. The next slide is a very interesting slide from Swing Time. These two legs are these huge railroad legs that open up, and when they open up, can we see the next slide? You see in blackface, how many people recognize it? Anybody recognize him? Fred Astaire. Good, you guys are good. Okay, Fred Astaire. What I want to argue about this is that this move. No, don't. Could we go back? Every time I raise my hand, you know. Okay, Fred Astaire. An implicit acknowledgement of white guilt and insufficiency seems to inform Fred Astaire's astonishing homage to Bill Robinson in Swing Time, this movie. A movie that begins to approach the subject of white jealousy about the vitality and flamboyance of black culture, what I'd call a black envy that the most celebrated African American performers attempted to use in their own favor. Okay, we're going to turn now to the next slide, and we're going to look at a few African American performers who also put on a kind of black face. Because the early 20th century entertainment industry was inundated by white performances of blackness, it's hardly surprising that African American artists also perform blackness. That is, African American artists also put on blackface. In other words, a number of African American artists found themselves imitating whites who were burlesquing blacks. Houston Baker has argued that the mastery of the minstrel mask constitutes a primary move in African American discursive modernism. To grasp the paradox implicit in this point, consider the contrast between this picture of Paul Robeson with his Phi Beta Kappa Key from Rutgers, Linda, by the way. He was at Rutgers, right? And the next two slides, the next slide where he wears harlequin pants from the minstrel tradition, and the next slide where he does a kind of ersatz Africanism on stage. Not X-colored, but recolored. And the same can be said of the next slide, Josephine Baker, who is wearing blackface in this performance. Not X-colored, but recolored. Josephine Baker literally applied blackface to the blackface so as to signal a comparable self-consciousness about her collusion with minstrel conventions. Cross-eyed and thus willfully blind to the spectacle she has made of herself, Baker derisively displays herself as an antic figure of fun. If the shuffling, grinning minstrel ridiculed African Americans as lazy or childish, Baker's pose burlesques the mockers through a kind of self-mockery. But it's very important that both of these artists, Robeson on the one hand, Josephine Baker on the other, also put out enormous numbers of very glamorous pictures of themselves. The next slide is a very famous slide. Many of you have seen probably Paul Robeson as Emperor Jones in the O'Neill production. And the next slide, Josephine Baker in her famous banana skirt in Paris. Both of these artists prepared the way for a new kind of race change in modernism through the glamour of their publicity. For if blackface movies replicated Minstrelsy's racism, modernist blacking up exhibited a high degree of what Renato Rosaldo calls imperialist nostalgia. I'll define his definition of imperialist nostalgia. This is Rosaldo. A person kills someone and then mourns the victim. People destroy their environment and then they worship nature. Imperialist nostalgia uses a pose of innocent yearning to capture people's imaginations and to conceal complicity with brutal domination. I want to look at the next few slides at the two most famous patrons of the Harlem Renaissance, Carl Van Vechten and Nancy Cunard, because I think they testify to a startling change during the early 20th century when Gauguin and Picasso, Conrad and Dvorak turned the arts towards primitivism, a primitivism associated with Africa. For Van Vechten and Cunard, the adversity endured by blacks imbued them with a resilient vitality that whites could only seek to emulate. So I'm moving from mockery here to mimicry. Bell Hooks furnishes an explanation for their mimicries when she speculates that the suffering imposed by structures of domination on those designated other may be deflected by a desire not to make the other over in one's own image, but to actually try to become the other. And this is, in fact, what Van Vechten and Cunard tried to do. While the Iowa-born Van Vechten underwent a racial metamorphosis in cartoon portraits, here he is photographed. And can we have the next two slides of him in cartoon form? This is a cartoon, and the next one. You can see the race change involved. Can we have the next slide? Cunard, sporting her personal trademark of African bracelets, looks like she has decked herself out for a photo op to illustrate Rosaldo's concept of imperialist nostalgia. Let's have a few more Cunard here. You see the African bangles that were very much her icon, they were her totem object. Okay, next one. This is a very famous, you see them very well here in Van Vechten's photograph, the black and the white. This is a very interesting photograph. This is a cover of a book done by Man Ray. And the next one. And finally, the last one. Okay. During the same years when Amos and Andy became a hit on the radio, Van Vechten's novel, Nigger Heaven, as well as Cunard's landmark anthology, Negro, drew attention to their extensive use of black talk through glossaries, footnotes, and translations. Like the racial ventriloquism of poets from Vachel Lindsay and Edith Sitwell to John Berryman, and of prose writers from Gertrude Stein to William Faulkner. The sort of black envy Van Vechten and Cunard exhibited could be considered a form of consumerism that consumes difference, making no racial difference at all to black people, or it may have laid the groundwork for aesthetic acknowledgments of cross-racial mutuality and cultural hybridity. And I'm going to turn now to three modernist artists who I think were very interested in notions of hybridity and cultural cross-racial mutuality. Man Ray, we'll start with Man Ray, and then Hannah Hoch, and then finally Richard Bruce Nugent. Three visual artists in the 1920s, moved from imperialist nostalgia through breakthrough meditations on the possibility of a post-racist, transracial acknowledgement of diversity. As if capturing or recapturing the impartiality of the Janiform vase from ancient Italy, the experiments of Man Ray, Hannah Hoch, and Richard Bruce Nugent best exemplify modernism's cosmopolitan multiculturalism. Man Ray's juxtaposition of the African sculpture with the equally impassive face of his model can be read as a meditation on his own name, a pseudonym, of course, Man Ray. For these photographs attest to the artist's self-consciousness about the reification of the male gaze, man's rays, on fetishized objects of Africanness and femininity. He was very interested in what he called solarizations, and he was interested in seeing the negatives of the positives of his photographs. And one more of Man Ray, the last one. It's a very beautiful photograph. Comparing Anglo and African light and dark forms of beauty, Man Ray's series postulates but bridges a gulf between black and white cultures. By constructing collages out of roughly carved aboriginal forms and photographed female figures, Hannah Hoch also plays African against Western images, in her case so as to illuminate Booker T. Washington's point that, and I'm quoting Washington, it is sometimes difficult to know where the black begins and the white ends. Could we have the next three slides? These are all Hannah Hoch, producing them in the 20s, pretty much, in the 30s. This next one is my favorite. It's a great one. Very odd, eerily surrealistic, isn't it? Hoch's photo montages, which use biracial imagery to meditate on the mind-body problem. You can really see the mind-body problem here, right? Explore the sometimes otherworldly, sometimes tragic, sometimes comic forces at work in what she called an ethnographic museum that compares women and primitives commercialized as commodity fetishes. Okay, we're now going to look at a series of four very beautiful drawings by Richard Bruce Nugent, an African-American artist in the Harlem Renaissance, again in the 20s. So we'll go through these. Maybe Richard Bruce Nugent's sequence of prints entitled Drawings for Mulattoes most strikingly combines concepts of the primitive with the Art Deco designs of someone like Audrey Beardsley to portray civilization as a fascinating amalgam of barbarism and decadence, African and Euro-American features. This sequence of pictures, which appeared in Charles Johnson's 1927 collection Ebony and Topaz, moves from an Art Nouveau African landscape to an extraordinary image of what I think you could think of in terms of W.E.B. Du Bois' double consciousness, right, those of you who know Du Bois, then to a hybrid female figure which fuses the African dancer with a white flapper, and finally to a vision of the Jazz Age as the attainment of a highly theatrical, sexily ersatz primitivism now commodified on sheet music, in cabarets, in Broadway. As a whole, Nugent's series of prints questions whether the move from the jungle to the Broadway stage or Harlem Club is one of evolution, devolution, or return, and for whom. When considered together, the work of Man Ray, Hannah Hoch, and Richard Bruce Nugent defamiliarized ideologies of race, demonstrating that whites and blacks were neither separate nor equal. Their work serves as a bridge to the final stage in race change that I'll discuss tonight, which returns us to the permeable boundaries the Crafts and Homer Plessy had traversed when they tried to pass as white. For white people also sometimes attempted to pass, and they too could use such impersonations for civil libertarian purposes. If hostility and derogation fueled blackface spirit murders in minstrelsy and movies, if black envy motivated modernist imperialist nostalgia, then the third stage of race change hints at white people's wish for a utopian cross-racial mutuality. So I'm moving from mockery to mimicry and now to a kind of mutuality. In popular culture, one might think of the television series Quantum Leap, which featured a white hero bounding sometimes into the bodies of oppressed black characters, or of several episodes in Northern Exposure, where you might remember that white Chris dreams his black brother's dreams. Or some of you might think of white rappers or hip-hop musicians. But such transracial shapeshifters had precursors who enacted their identification with the oppressed other to signal the wish, not always granted, of interracial mutability, mutuality. When Virginia Woolf and her friends dressed up as the Emperor of Abyssinia and his entourage for an official inspection of one of the most famous ships in the British fleet, the so-called Dreadnoughts hoax made a mockery of British military superiority, as well as the rites and rituals of imperial etiquette. Woolf is the person on the left, on the very left, in blackface, dressing up as an Abyssinian prince. Woolf's masquerade as an exotic other cannot be conflated with the magical race change inflicted as a punishment on a racist senator in the musical comedy Finian's Rainbow. This is in 1947. This is the film version of the Broadway musical comedy where a racist senator has his comeuppance by being turned into an African American. Next slide. Norman Mailer's impersonation was something else again. Mailer's modeling of himself on the alienated but savvy hipster he called the white Negro, this is 1956, displayed a bad case of what Michelle Wallace has called, and I'm going to try to get this right, the I've got the pseudo-Anglo-Saxon technological male menopausal 20th century civilized man's blues. Should I do that again? No, you've got it. So he has to be distinguished from John Howard Griffin. Many of you read this book in high school. John Howard Griffin's successful effort to pass as an African American, which he used to launch a scathing attack on segregation in the South in the popular bestseller Black Like Me, which came out in the early 60s. This is a still from the movie. Different as they are, Woolf, Finian's Rainbow, Mailer, Black Like Me, all imply that racial metamorphosis can transform not only the individual's conscience or consciousness, but also our common conceptualizations of Western culture. At the present moment, popular magazines have devoted many words and pictures to illustrate the proposition that the incidence of births of mixed-race babies has multiplied 26 times as fast as that of any other group. And I'm sure you've seen, this happens to come from Newsweek in 1993, but there are many other instances of pictures of mixed-race families. Contemporary Benetton ads and makeup features in glossy magazines have touted the glamour of race change. This is one actress, one model, with different makeup on her face and different hair, wigs and things. I mean, Americans today seem to be fascinated with race change as an effort to attain some kind of transracial consciousness. American photographers, and this is of course Robert Mapplethorpe, have experimented with race change in a number of high cultural venues. We'll look at 3 Mapplethorpes to see what he's doing with black and white. This one, the next one. It's a very beautiful photograph, I think. And the next one. A recent technological form of racial transformation, Queen Elizabeth if she were a black woman, a recent technological form of racial transformation, a computer program called Morph for metamorphosis, can mix features in such a way as to produce a picture of Queen Elizabeth as a black woman. Similarly, the fall 1993 issue of Time magazine featured a cover devoted to what was called the New Face of America, a computer-created portrait of a new Eve whose racial and ethnic features reflected the Anglo-Saxon, Middle Eastern, African, Asian, Southern European, and Hispanics used to produce the composite image. This racially mixed, computerized cover girl was put together to dramatize the impact of multi-ethnic marriage. Yet, despite the editor's purportedly libertarian purposes, it plummeted the theorist Donna Haraway into a dyspeptic attack of political correctness, at diversity paradoxically transfigured into what she called a numbingly boring homogeneity. Perhaps this Eve ensures the difference of no difference in the human family to Haraway, because diversity has been achieved at the price of heterogeneity. Indeed, many signs of the times suggest that color continues to play a very divisive role. So I started by saying that mockery and mimicry still exist in our culture. It's not as if we've gotten to some third stage and left all of our history behind. When O.J. Simpson's face was darkened on a Time magazine cover in order to criminalize him, when Susan Smith produced a composite sketch of the so-called black man who supposedly abducted her children, a picture, by the way, that reminded the police of a darkened version of her estranged husband, race change as spirit murder clearly continued. So I'm not arguing that we've left this bad history behind. I think it's still very much with us. My final series of images were produced by 2 artists, Robert Colescott and Faith Ringgold, the most brilliant African-American painters to exploit race changes. Colescott is an artist who shares Haraway's suspicion about America's passage into an Edenic diversity or hybridity, for he seeks to demonstrate just how far off the promised end of a multicultural, post-racist society remains. Using race change to parody conventions of Western art, this witty African-American artist draws attention to the absence of the black subject in the great masterpieces of Western culture, as well as the stereotyping that occurs whenever that subject does appear. Oh, that's not right. Could you go back one? Could you go back one, Linda? Could you go back one? Oh, I have them in the wrong order. Oh, dear. All right, go ahead. We'll talk our way through. This is Colescott's portrait of Saint Sebastian. That's what he calls this, which qualifies mythologies of hybridity by presenting the mixed offspring. Right? I mean, the figure on the left is the white father, and the upper left, the figure on the right is the African-American mother. The figure on the cross is their offspring, and notice on a cross lashed about by a rope, and hermaphroditic, both male and female, in a kind of gruesome way. Black and white here is not mutuality, it's a kind of strain, a kind of horrible hermaphrodism. Colescott's portrait of Saint Sebastian qualifies mythologies of hybridity by presenting the mixed offspring of interracial unions as a schizophrenic, hermaphroditic martyr lashed by a history that outlawed cross-racial love as miscegenation. Okay, this is Colescott's painting Shirley Temple Black and Bill Robinson White, in which Colescott switches the races to ridicule first our assumptions about white hegemony in cultural scripts, and second, the caricaturing that immediately infects almost all depictions of African Americans in mass-produced as well as elite art. Colescott uses the sly excuse of Shirley Temple's married name to perform a race change that asks us to wonder why innocence, spontaneity, adorableness, and wisdom accrue only to the white child. At the same time, his disturbing imagery suggests that racial transformation sexualizes, draining away the innocence of the child and infusing her with a vaguely perverse ribaldry. Gruesome in their blatant ironies, some of Colescott's paintings set out to shock us. Eat Dem Taters, 1975, is a race-changed version, obviously, of Van Gogh's The Potato Eaters, and it hints at theft by reminding us of what one critic calls the already negroid features of the downtrodden peasants in the original. Not simply a portrait of the parallel oppressions of black sharecroppers and European peasants. Colescott's painting proves that the exploitation of the European peasant received its due in the dignified portrait painted by Van Gogh. However, American blacks suffered the added indignity of a representation that scornfully presents them happily embracing their impoverishment. The characters seated around the table in Eat Dem Taters look less like African Americans, more like 19th century minstrels' depictions of African Americans. Similarly, in George Washington Carver Crossing the Delaware, a 1975 brilliant painting, I think, Colescott gives us not the father of our country, but one of the very few black figures to enter American history books, surrounding him with the Stephen Feshets, the Aunt Jemimas, and the Harlequin minstrels so popular on the American stage. While Emanuel Lutz's original, Washington Crossing the Delaware, testifies to the historical liberation of America by its first national leader, Colescott's parody launches George Washington Carver in a ship of fools, on a resonant river packed with equally suggestive cottony ice flows, to contrast the myth of freedom established by the Founding Fathers with the reality of slavery, even as he slyly hints that Minstrelsy's version of African Americans provided the founding origins of American culture. The last Colescott painting I will show you, this one, Les Demoiselles d'Alabama, is a clear revision of Picasso's famous Demoiselles d'Avignon. Can we go to the next slide and then back? This is the Picasso Demoiselles d'Avignon. Can we go back? Back one? Thank you. Although Picasso tended to turn his African models into abstract forms, Colescott returns them to a more fleshly physicality. In doing so, he points to the ways in which white artists have tended to commodify the African American women who served as their models, but who were literally painted out of their pictures. We'll go back to the Demoiselles d'Avignon now. Forward one. And then forward one more. I want to end this lecture with Faith Ringgold, an African-American painter who tackles this same subject through the medium of what she called story quilts. These are huge canvases that are quilted and painted with representational scenes accompanied by written narratives that form a complete story, as in the 12 works in her recent French collection. So you can see there's writing on the bottom of the quilt that tells the story about the characters in the quilt. This particular quilt is called Picasso's Studio, and it marginalized the painter Picasso on the left in his studio beneath his African masks, and gives central stage to the black model whose human form contrasts sharply with the canvas that he is painting. And you can see the demoiselle canvas behind her heroine. In her next picture, which is called Picnic at Giverny, the power arrangements have shifted once again. For Picasso, for the painter here is the black woman artist. Can you see her on the right in her white dress? The black woman artist, while poor Picasso on the lower left here, now unclothed and looking a bit askance at his own degeneration into an object of display, now sits naked and silent as the model. Now, this is clearly a reinvention, too. If we look at the next slide, you'll see it's a reinvention of Déjeuner sur l'herbe. But let's go back to it again. Let's go back and see the difference that this makes. A reinvention of Déjeuner sur l'herbe by Manet. This picture by Ringgold bequeaths to the African-American artist a multiracial community of support. Notice they are sitting in Monet's famous garden, Giverny, that allows Ringgold to right the wrongs of past racial representations. Can we go two more? One, and then to the last slide. This is the last slide I'm going to be showing you, and it's called Dinner at Gertrude Stein's. Ringgold redefines modernism itself here, taking into account the terms I've outlined tonight. For her, modernism is thoroughly miscegenated. Zora Neale Hurston mingles with Alice B. Toklas, Ernest Hemingway with James Baldwin, Langston Hughes with Pablo Picasso. Despite some artists' pessimism about the process of learning about the other by being the other, their work testifies to continued fascination with the permeable boundaries of racial markers as a source of aesthetic inspiration and experimentation. Perhaps Western culture's fascination with racial imitation has gone unnoted because of generalized discomfort over images that abrogate conventional boundaries, and because of guilty embarrassment at what we have rightly been taught to view as racist activity. Yet, as we have seen, race change can function not only for reactionary but also for experimental and libertarian ends. America's first national theater, first talking pictures, first radio shows, first new journalism, as well as Europe's first experimental literature, painting, and photography, all were marked by racial impersonation. Most frequently whites masquerading as Africans or African Americans. To ignore such performances is on the one hand to miss an opportunity to examine the manifold dynamics of cross-racial identification, and on the other hand to lose the chance to uncover the extent to which Western culture, not simply indebted to black aesthetic form, must be considered profoundly African American. Thank you.
beautiful presentation actually showed how, in a way, race, through mockery and mimicry, stays in this like a tonic position, which is like spinning, around the same actual point. And at the same time, the problem of biology and body representation, which goes beyond biology into imaginary standards. So I wonder if that third position, the position of mutuality that you mentioned, would go away from that dichotomy into a third, hopefully, better position.
Yeah, I think it does try to make it, a leap out. I think what I was trying to say is that we don't leave the first two behind us, that they are accompanying us in our American culture. And that's very hard sometimes, gets back to the first question, to assess when something is truly that mutuality and when it's a rip-off, when it's just an appropriation or a form of stereotyping. And that is also an independent decision. If these things are, Nancy Cunard, who I put kind of mimicked black and gold, she considered herself, a very, very progressive person. She was in a cross-racial relationship. She had a black lover friend all her life. She produced the first major anthology of black writing that included writing not only from African Americans but from Africans and West Indians. And yet we look at her and think of it as a kind of fetishization. So, it's a very complex issue how you evaluate these things. But yes, one would hope that mutuality would be something that would in some way be a third term. Yes.
Moving the agenda just a little bit to a different direction. What does it mean that we're having a presidential election right now, and women disappeared, people of color disappeared?
I haven't noticed that.
Good. What is going on? And why is it so difficult in the United States to have people who are truly other be in positions of power? But in Nicaragua, which we think of as a really macho society, that had a woman between two eras that was very instrumental in helping the country reach Britain, have a prime minister that's female. What's the difference here?
I don't know. It's a very interesting question. Of course, I wouldn't point to Margaret Thatcher as a model. Given what she did in higher education there. But women have only had the vote for about 60 years, 80 years. So I get this question a lot after feminist talks, but we've only been, really, we've only had reproductive rights for 40 years. We've only had, we've been in the Army and the Navy for how many years? 10, 20? So the more hopeful way to think of it is that, there will be this new age. There will be this new... I certainly felt that looking at the Olympics last night. I couldn't believe the women I was looking at. They looked so strong and powerful and ready to go, and of all ethnicities, and they were representing this country, and it gave me a terrific boost. But yes, the country is very recalcitrant about allowing women and African American men and women political visibility. There is no question about it. Probably it's related to this entire very long history of ridicule and subordination. Yeah. There was another hand over here, one of the students.
Well, if there's no more questions, I don't want to...
Over here, yeah.
I just have a little bit of trouble with mimicry and mockery and those distinctions. For example, on a Saturday Night Live one time, they had a sketch where they used sort of that black person from Alpha to Alpha. And it was returning lady man march, and they were Alpha.
judge. I mean, I would like to ask you, if I had not told you that Robert Colescott was African American, wouldn't you find some of that material disturbing? I would. If that were a white painter, I would have found it very disturbing. So yes, these are very difficult and very distressing and slippery issues. And what is mockery to someone, is mimicry to someone else, is a form of mutuality to a third person. I think that the signature does make a difference. So that, for instance, I don't know the particular thing you're talking about, but there was a Eddie Murphy thing on Saturday Night Live where I don't remember, he's on a bus, and does anybody remember that? He's on a bus and all the white people, no, he's white and all the black people leave, and then all of a sudden all the white people start partying. And his idea is,